Okay, so as is his wont, Phil Spencer conducted a couple of interviews after the Xbox Games Showcase, and there were a few sort of nuggets of new information that came out. Obviously, within the event, we had the announcement of a $350 1 terabyte Xbox Series S, and the logical question is, what's happening with Pro consoles? Are they going to be happening this generation? And essentially, we've got a quote here from one of those interviews. This one seemed to be from Bloomberg. Phil saying, in terms of Pro Console, he doesn't feel an imperative to do one. And that's not the feedback we're getting right now. Right now, we're pretty set on the hardware we have. And this is in the context of leaks from Insider Gaming, I believe, that are talking about, first of all, a PS5 console revision with a detachable optical drive. And I believe they also leaked or reported on a leak of the Q handheld. The Q handheld has come to pass. So it's curious to see whether we're going to have a situation where we'll have Sony producing a Pro console, Microsoft potentially not. John, what do you make of this? I mean, we're kind of on the record as saying that we don't need Pro consoles, right?
Yep, and I still agree with that notion. I think that's not the play right now. It took a long time to get to the point where you can walk into a store and buy these machines, and even then, it still can be a little bit sketchy in terms of whether you get one. It feels like the generation's really still just beginning. The cross-gen period is finally on its way out. It just kind of feels like those just finally able to get their consoles, they don't want to necessarily hear like, hey, it's time to upgrade to the new machine, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when, you have stuff like the PS5 with 8K written on the box, and we still haven't seen that. And it just feels like it would be closing the door on these machines too quickly. And so, I think also Microsoft told us this back when we saw the Series X for the first time, that the Series X is their mid-gen refresh. They just decided to do it like ahead of time, I guess you could say. The Series S is what they consider like the standard machine. And then Series X is like, that's getting ahead of the cart there. And this is what you might get from a mid-gen console. And I think, even with all the talk around Starfield and 30 FPS, I don't really think that's necessarily a limitation in the machine. That's just Bethesda doing Bethesda things. It's a great box, and we're still waiting for it to get truly fully utilized by developers and come into its own.
To clarify the S and X thing, obviously last generation we had an S and an X console, and I think they just transplanted that across to the current generation. So, the Series S is the equivalent of the 1S from the last generation, and Series X is the equivalent of the 1X. It's just you're getting both of them at the same time at launch.
Exactly.
So, and obviously there was quite a long discussion we had about the problems of creating a new console that's meaningfully different from the current one, given price constraints. Mm-hmm. Alex, your thoughts on this one?
I'm with Phil Spencer here. I other than from like the weirdly hardcore who wants, I don't know exactly what they want, but they want new Pro consoles for some reason. I think we still have yet to tap into what is going on with this gen. We still barely have seen any UE5 releases, which is supposed to be the generation's engine at this point in time. I saw the other day that, with each and every generation come to pass, they get longer. You had your 360, your PS3 gen, then the last generation. And I imagine this one is just going to be the longest one yet. I don't see why it would change.
I mean, with development, it does get longer and harder.
Yeah. So the thing is, we just need actually a stable base to be formed first before we start talking about changing anything. And this goes, I don't even have to talk about the fact that I think the upgrade path in the console space, based upon the hardware that AMD has on offer yet, is not compelling enough from my perspective to make an upgrade in any sense that were really worth it. Without just complicating the development environment so much so. So I'm not happy if there's actually a PS5 Pro, to be honest with you.
You're not happy?
I wouldn't be very happy with it. I want them to make the most out of PS5 and then see what happens there, instead of already making PS5 the oh, you get like a 30 FPS experience machine and we can't fit everything we want on it because we don't put everything we want on it and the PS5 Pro. I don't want to see that thing happening. And, I want to see them first do as much as they can with the PS5. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I've got some thoughts on this, and I agree with you primarily, which is that in a world where we haven't really seen the current consoles fully utilized, owing to the kind of legacy of cross-generation hardware, kind of makes sense not to do one immediately. However, if, as you say, Alex, the console generation is much longer than previous, there may well be a small percentage of users who would actually want a more performant machine. And the question is how much more performance you can get. Now, you're not going to be doubling the size of the GPU and producing a cost-efficient box, right?
No.
So what could you do? That's an interesting question. Maybe we should break that out into a different video. But just off the top of my head, you could have machine learning blocks for better upscaling. The current generation of Zen CPUs are much better than Zen 2. And that's been a problem for... I was actually quite interested to see that it seems to be CPU that is a primary limiting factor of the sort of latest wave of games.
Yep.
So I do think there is maybe an argument for a machine that would be aimed at what you might call the most discerning audience. Now, a bit of other feedback to give you is... whether you can actually call it feedback or stuff, but essentially... Last generation, the split between the Pro consoles and the base consoles was 80% in favor of the base console. So, there's not going to be a huge commercial imperative to do a Pro console when it's addressing a minority of the audience. But maybe that minority would pay, a couple of $100 extra, that would pay a stupid amount, what we would consider a stupid amount for a console in order to get a premium experience. So I'm kind of curious as to see whether this is going to happen on the Sony side, because I think from what Phil is saying here is that it's not going to happen from Microsoft. This is as close to him ruling it out as we're going to get.
Yeah.
I am finding it quite interesting, the wording that's being used here. That's not the feedback we're getting right now.
Could change.
Now, this is well, possibly, but more to the point is that it takes a long time. It takes like 4 years to make a console.
Yeah.
So you can't really use feedback in the here and now to have an influence on the planning stages of the console, which would have happened years ago. That's the other thing to bear in mind there. So I think maybe the feedback he's talking about is the sales split of the last generation Pro versus base consoles, where, you've got to take a view on, if those 20% of people aren't happy with current base console performance, Microsoft have got that covered. You can go and buy a PC, right?
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's the sort of solution.
I think we're getting to an interesting point though, where I think they might be able to start to justify this as like cell phone like upgrades, because this was supposed to be a new generation, and frankly it just feels like a continuation of the last generation.
Yes, that is it. The complete sort of jettisoning of the console generation. That's the kind of alternative scenario, and some might say we've already had it because it's taken us 3 years to get rid of the last gen.
And I don't think this is something we can solely place on the onus of the console manufacturer. I think that we're actually bumping up against limitations of development studios, like the manpower necessary to make modern games. Development cycles are so long now, and it just requires so much effort and work to get the fidelity people want that I don't think it's feasible to go that far beyond and so many projects to the point where you could say, oh, this is totally next gen and totally different from what we had before. It's all just building on what we already have. And, if you've had a game that's been in development for 3 years already, and then you come out 2 years into a new cycle, it's like you weren't necessarily able to target that super ultra high end thing anyway. And I don't know. It does kind of feel like the end of generations is here, and it's due mainly to just, it's the state of hardware and the development of games. It's just changed too much.
Yeah, interesting perspective here from supporter Roach. IDF, with Phil Spencer hinting there likely won't be a mid-gen Pro console for Xbox. Do you think that's because the next Xbox will just be a Series successor anyway? Quite possible. It's a possibility, or possibly is it because Moore's law is slowing down and therefore they can't develop a console with a meaningful boost in performance at the midpoint? I think this is something which was actually brought up at our visit to Microsoft back in the day. They seem to be saying Moore's law is fine, but the cost of these reductions in fabrication nodes is proving too much to create a cost-effective console. Technically, I think they've gone in the right direction with console design by having a desktop CPU in there, just like the PS5. So they've basically produced a small form factor PC that now just needs better performing components, which will not surprisingly remain compatible with previous gen games, just like a PC. So yeah, I mean, he's basically putting forward the idea that you are, John, that essentially we're moving into a more iterative phase of console design. But I think there's ways you could disrupt that. For example, switch to NVIDIA.
That would do things. I also think the thing about the CPU stuff, right? We are seeing games are more CPU limited, but if we look at the way they're CPU limited on PC, it really suggests there's a lot of inefficiency there. Like what was achieved on last generation Jaguar CPUs is insane when you consider how underpowered those are. But the Zen 2 CPU in these machines is not bad. Right? I think it's perfectly suitable for these consoles. And what we're seeing instead is just like a lot of inefficiencies in the games and the engines, especially on the Unreal side. I mean, and that's, again, the PC reveals all. We can look at the core spread. We can see how the utilization scales. And you can definitely tell that these things are perhaps not scaling as well as they should. Yeah. And so, we are CPU limited. But I feel like we shouldn't necessarily have to be. Yeah,
I agree with that, John. Like, I'm just thinking there is actually a famous quote about this, about usually you would imagine hardware making what we already have so much faster. But you can boot up, for example, like a modern browser or a modern text input program and see how much more bloated it is in terms of processing power and speed versus a text processor that was in the late 80s, which has honestly similar functions for a lot of things. So you see more hardware there on the table with Zen 2 processors in modern consoles, but they're kind of also used partially as a crutch to ease development so you don't spend as much time crunching to get ultra fast performance. You just use it to get acceptable performance. And that isn't that great from a perspective of, well, you're leaving a lot on the table. It's pretty inefficient. It's also not great for the consumer necessarily because, like we see with Gotham Knights, which I think is a prime example of this, especially at launch, where that game really looks like it should be 60 FPS. And then if you examine the way it looks on PC and the way it performs on PC, you see it's leaving a lot of performance on the table on the CPU side of things. So yeah, I agree with John there. And it's a little bit sad that it is the case we see here. In terms of what they would bring to the table, even if they brought out a new box, like Rich was getting at earlier, I do think the machine learning idea of a mid-gen refresh is the most compelling out of all of them. Like Rich has floated it before in conversation. It's Xbox One S-like, where that console it was a little bit tweaked, a little bit better in some areas. It had HDR support, has VRR support. Am I wrong there?
It does, yeah.
So it's something like that would add a little bit of spice to help the generation going, and maybe something new, a little bit more daring. Maybe there's a machine learning block on the GPU now, so developers can tap into that to get better upscaling as the generation goes on and it gets longer in the tooth. That's something I would vastly prefer, and to just doubling and butterflying the GPU like last time with the PS4 Pro and keeping a semi-mediocre CPU in there and a similar amount of VRAM, available video memory. I mean, I thought that was pretty boring in comparison to other things they could have done. Yeah.
Yeah, and yet it sold. That's the other thing. I've got a question here from Who the Hell Am I? As previously discussed, Microsoft announced a 1TB Series S. I'm curious to hear Rich's thoughts on it. Does it mirror what Oliver, John, and Alex said? And also, how would you guys feel if instead of a 1TB Series S, Microsoft announced a $400 digital-only Series X a la PS5 digital? Yeah, a couple of points on that. 1TB Series S, the thing that surprised me, and it was what John said in the Microsoft Direct, is $349. the price point doesn't make sense, right? We're kind of now 3 years into the cycle of the consoles where typically you would be looking at cost reductions of the consoles, but we're not seeing them. We are seeing like bundle deals and stuff like that, but fundamentally, the MSRPs of the consoles are not really shifting.
Didn't they go up?
Mm-hmm.
They did at one point, yeah.
Are they back down to the original?
I don't know about that. It never changed in the US.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
But it did change elsewhere. Yeah.
It did change elsewhere, yeah. I just think that the $349 price point is kind of saying to me that they can't reduce the prices, which again puts further pressure on the concept of a pro console. The fact that they can't do it 3 years in is kind of concerning.
Shocked by that, man. Like a $299 1 terabyte Series S would have been such a big win for them. Especially Starfield's coming, get this box, $299, got more storage. You know, just I'm surprised by
I think we need to wait and see what's going to happen at Black Friday, because we did actually see Series S deals.
It's true. And this new Series S is black as well, so maybe double deals.
Double up on that black. Yeah. Whatever.
I think the one thing that's going to be interesting to see is if there is a PS5 Pro and there isn't an Xbox Pro. I'm going to be really interested to see, first of all, how the perception of that plays out. And secondly, just how much more meaningful a PS5 Pro would actually be. In terms of who the hell am I's question about a $400 digital-only Series X. Series X was a very expensive machine to make. I still think it's probably more expensive to make than the PlayStation 5 because, they've got some pretty extreme cooling in there.
Yeah, they do.
They've got a much bigger die, a much bigger chip. They've got more memory modules. So, the concept of being able to produce a cost-reduced version when there's only one component that's changing, the optical drive, I think that was challenging enough for Sony to do, and I think it's even more challenging for Microsoft to do. So it's possibly one of these things where, as users, there's a portion of the audience, not including John, that might have liked to see it. But the other thing, of course, is that unit would put even more pressure on the $299 Series S. It's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't really know what more to add to that. It's all going to sort of come down to how these consoles will reduce in cost, in form factor over the next year or so.
I mean, the trouble point I could see for Xbox, and I don't know if this would happen, would be like Sony comes out like they did with the PS4 Pro. You had a PS5 Pro at $499, and then you have the regular PS5 down to $399, and maybe it's like a slim model, right? Like new slim PS5 $399, slim or redesigned PS5 Pro, and then now you have like the full fat PS5 experience at $399, and that's I don't know if they could even make that happen, but there
is the detachable optical drive rumor that's going around.
That's a bad rumor.
I think it's going to happen, John.
Dude, that's going to kill discs. I think it's so bad, dude.
Well, I think it actually also means that at least if you have got one of those base units without an optical drive, you can actually get one. That's the main issue I've got with Series S at the moment, right? And it's something I'd really like to ask Phil about, which is he's really into the concept of a library that you take with you through the generations, right? But if you were an Xbox One S owner who bought physical discs, you can't take your games through to the next generation because the Series S is a digital-only device.
Yeah.
So the detachable optical drive system would actually at least make that happen, right?
I mean, if it were to become part of like a slim base unit, and then like say the conceivable Pro, the PS5 Pro was like always with the disc unit, then that would be all right.
Mm-hmm.
But if it becomes fully optional, I think that would kill disc media.
I think there's still, the fact that 50% of games are still sold physical, they can't turn their back on that.
I don't think they should. And having that retail presence, it may not seem like a big deal, but I think it does matter in terms of like mind share. Like Nintendo especially dominates retail stores. You walk into the game section, you're going to see a sea of red Switch cases everywhere.
Yeah.
And there's just Switch stuff all over. People see that and they think about it.
For children.
I think it matters.
For children market audiences, going into a store and actually seeing the physical things that you can touch and maybe even play a demo of, it's a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's all we really got to say about that at the moment. And I do think at this point, with this announcement, the ball is kind of in Sony's court. Is this happening or is it not happening? We'll just have to wait and see, right?